What does Canadian citizenship mean to you? For some people, it's a very easy answer. It means a passport. It means the ability to live and work in Canada. It means another country where you can build let's be honest, a better life, to travel, to study, or to have a second home, or even retire to. Now, all of these things are real. Canadian citizenship is an extraordinarily valuable thing to have. But if you're pursuing Canadian citizenship by descent, I think there's another question underneath all of that. Why does this matter to you? Because citizenship by descent is different from simply deciding that you'd like to become Canadian because you happen to have a Canadian ancestor and can prove that lineage between them and you. I'm Dr. Mikael, and I am Canadian by descent, and you might be too. I'm a professional genealogist specialized in historical document research and analysis. I help people locate, interpret, and organize the genealogical records that they need to demonstrate direct descent from a Canadian ancestor. Please note that I'm not an immigration consultant or a lawyer. Nothing I ever provide is meant to be construed as legal advice. I don't provide advice on any legal proceedings or applications relating to the citizenship procedures. I'm a genealogist and a historian who can help you with the research and compilation of the genealogical records that you need, with less hassle, more clarity, and peace of mind. So you might have a Canadian grandparent, great grandparent, maybe five times great granny came from Hamilton, Ontario. Perhaps even someone further back in your family tree, maybe from the 17th century. Bonjour, Monsieur Cadien. And somewhere along the way, that connection to Canada became more or less distant. Or maybe like a lot of people, you were hanging your hat on Irish citizenship by descent, but just didn't quite make that generational gap. And it turns out your Irish ancestor had children. He moved to Canada, had children in Canada. That's where your great great grandmother came from. That's more than one person with that story. Turns out now you can apply for Canadian citizenship by descent, assuming great granny was actually born in Canada and you can document it and all of that. But maybe your family, one way or another, left Canada generations ago. Some of them maybe even went back and they died before you were born. Maybe your family never even talked about the fact that you had a Canadian connection, or perhaps you always knew, but nobody realized that would ever have any legal significance for you. And then one day, you discover it. You find a record, you see a birthplace, you discover that your great granddad wasn't born where you thought he was. He was born in Canada. Or you've recently, sometime in the last 8 months or so, heard about the amendment to the Citizenship Act of Canadian law, so called Bill C-3. And suddenly, that's something that's been sitting quietly in your family history becomes relevant to your life today. And that's a rather remarkable thing because citizenship by descent isn't simply about acquiring something new. In many cases, it's about documenting something that was already part of your family story. You're not inventing a Canadian connection, you're tracing something that already exists and documenting it. It's already part of your story. Because, of course, where we come from and where our ancestors lived and who they were and how they lived is already part of our identity. We're just more or less aware of it or more or less embracing of the role that that has. So that's why I think it's worth taking the family history side of your Canadian ancestry seriously, because your genealogy isn't just a collection of interesting names and dates that get you a different legal status. It's a story about how you got here, who your grandparents were, who their parents were, where they lived, why they moved, who they married, and where their children were born. Some of them where their children died and how they moved on. What happened to the family one generation to the next? And when you're establishing your Canadian citizenship by descent, those details suddenly matter in a very concrete way. You discover that the story of your family, the story that your family has told, was broadly right, sometimes maybe not exactly right. A surname was spelled differently. The date of a birth or a death or a marriage was off by a couple of years. Maybe someone was born in the neighboring village rather than the big town that everybody remembered. A middle name all of a sudden appears on one record as their normal name that they go by, but not on another one. Someone uses an English version of a name after immigrating, or even before immigrating, because Canada is bilingue, right? It's got two languages. None of those things necessarily destroys a case, but of course they need to be understood because the objective isn't simply to find documents and then submit them and say, here, you work it out. The objective is to establish a coherent chain of identity from that Canadian ancestor to you. And that's where I think also that the deeper meaning of Canadian citizenship by descent becomes interesting. So, citizenship is, among other things, a legal relationship between you and a country. Now, the concept of citizenship has evolved significantly, transformed and changed over the last even 200 years, and is in flux today, right? Even how we understand citizenship is a is an evolving, changing thing and is not treated the same necessarily from one country to another. If you want to hear more about that basic idea, let me know in the comments and I'll try and create a video about that specifically. The evolving nature of citizenship, especially pertaining to Canada versus the US over the last 200 years. But ancestry, so citizenship is a relationship with a country, a state specifically, a legal entity, political entity. But ancestry is a relationship between you and your family. Now, sometimes those two things intersect. You may have spent your entire life in another country and never thought of yourself as a Canadian. You may not have a Canadian accent. There's more than one Canadian accent, by the way. You may never have lived in Canada, and you may not know very much about the place where your ancestor lived, or necessarily much about the place you might want to live. But we'll come back to that in another video. Again, comment below, let me know where you want to move to if you're planning to move to Canada. And yet you may discover that Canada is part of your inheritance. Not necessarily inheritance of money or property, although we may have a secret dream and a wish that we could step into some castle somewhere, right? But an inheritance of identity. And that doesn't mean you suddenly have to pretend to be something that you're not. I want to be just clear with you. It's easy when we're looking at Canadian citizenship by descent to really delve into the weeds of records and paper documents, digitized or otherwise, and lose sight of the identity aspect. What does it mean to realize that you're Canadian? What does that mean for your identity to incorporate this story of your ancestry into your lived reality? So you can be deeply rooted in the country where you were born and raised and still have a meaningful connection to another country through your family. Human beings have always operated on multiple layers of belonging and identity. There's where we were born, where our parents came from, what language we speak growing up, where our grandparents lived, where we moved to, the kind of job that I have, perhaps the religious group I belong to, where I travel, lifestyle, the traditions that my family carries, the places that we've left behind, and the places where we've built new lives. Citizenship can be one formal expression of those connections, but it's not the only one. So if you're researching citizenship by descent, I'd encourage you not to think of the process as simply, how do I get my Canadian certificate of citizenship? And from that, how do I get my Canadian passport? Two very important steps that we need to keep in mind. And it's an understandable question, something we need to be able to focus on for those who are pursuing that route. But perhaps a deeper question that's just as important, maybe more important, if less urgent, is this. What exactly is my connection to Canada? And what does it mean for me? Who was my Canadian ancestor? Who were my Canadian ancestors? What were their lives like? Where did they come from? What were their motivations, their hopes, their dreams, their fears, their challenges? What happened to them? How did their descendants eventually become your family? And how do you document that story? Because once you understand that, the paperwork becomes much, much more meaningful. You're no longer just assembling documents for a legal application of something to some distant bureaucrat. You're reconstructing a piece of your own family's history, it's your own identity, in the process of establishing a legal connection to Canada that's been sitting there for generations. So if you're just starting out on this journey, or if you're well on the way, but you hit a brick wall somewhere, I can help you out with tracking down the genealogical records you need to prove your Canadian lineage. I can also assess and evaluate the records that you already have to ensure consistency, clarity, and coherence, and help you compile those into a professionally organized proof case that you can submit with confidence alongside your application. I don't deal with the application side of things. That's strictly reserved to Canadian immigration lawyers and immigration consultants. But when it comes to the genealogical expertise, to check not for legal issues, but for clarity, consistency, and coherence, I'm your man. Reach out to me at the link below. But finally, I just want to leave you with this question. If you've discovered that you have a Canadian ancestor and can prove the unbroken line from them to you, what does your potential Canadian citizenship actually mean to you? Would it just simply be another passport, an opportunity for your children or grandchildren? Would it be a connection to a country you've always felt deeply about or always been curious for? Or would it feel like reclaiming something that's been a part of your family all along? There's no right answer, but knowing your answer to that question may be the most interesting part of this entire journey. And I'd love to hear your story and what Canadian citizenship means to you in the comments below.